Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the first Friday in April. We are here with Solidarity Live to discuss democracy reform, the progressive agenda, and many other exciting things and ways in which we hope to win this year. Good morning, Alex. How are you?
Hi, Jocelyn.
Hi.
Good. It's sunny. It's a little cold, but I feel like in pandemic adjusted terms, it's a pretty good Friday. This week was sort of like there's a lot happening, but I don't know. Maybe I'm a little optimistic. I'm suffering from a bout of optimism right now, and part of that is that I do think that progressives are sort of feeling their way into how we're dealing with power and fighting for what we want and winning more than losing. And I want to keep doing that. And I don't think that it's at all a given that that is going to keep happening if we don't stay organized, if we don't just really understand what our show's all about with solidarity. So I wanted to, I'm really happy to have our guest, Mary Small, the legislative director of Indivisible, joining us today to talk about that, to talk about how we have had some victories. There's some big fights to come, but by being organized and staying together, we're going to be able to win things for the people. So Mary, thanks so much for joining us here on Solidarity Live.
Yeah, really happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So I think just starting out, maybe a teeny bit of retrospective, but we worked together quite closely on progressive voting block stuff, which is basically trying to coordinate the groups to stay together in order to flex and to get it across to people that you can't just ignore us. You need us, and by the people I mean politicians. And I think that the American Rescue Plan was a tremendous success of that. And I want to just throw out there that I used to, back in the Obama era, during like Bowles Simpson, I can find these threads. I'll forward them to you. There'd be times where the schisms would start within the progressive movement, and we'd be like maybe starting to go different ways. And I was slightly famous, infamous, whatever it was, on the listservs for always posting this video from Gladiator, where Russell Crowe is saying, "Stay together. Anything that comes out of that door, we can defeat if we stay together." And it was my little way of being like, please don't turn on each other over small differences and sometimes big differences. But if we're agreeing on 90%, let's all get those gains, pocket them, never be satisfied, and demand more. And that the victories that we have build on it. So is that where you're feeling we are right now? Like we're building on a victory that we just had?
Yeah, I think that's totally right. That there were some key progressive wins in the American Rescue Plan. Some of them were due to the fact that progressives, particularly in the House, banded together and played a little bit of soft hardball to make sure that their priorities stayed in and weren't compromised, both inside of the House and once the bill went over to the Senate side. And I think that yes, there's a lot to sell about the American Rescue Plan to the American people, like real money in folks' pockets, but also about like the tactics for politicians of banding together and saying, you don't just make concessions to the moderates. You're not just making concessions to the right flank of the Democratic Party, but actually progressives are organized, wielding their votes kind of collectively in these negotiations, and that we're real contenders in the political process too.
Well, and I love that you say that, because I find as progressives, we are sort of engaged in this communal gaslighting a little bit of having to constantly prove that we are, in fact, a powerful political group, which is crazy because if you look at any part of the progressive agenda, whether we're talking about healthcare justice or climate justice or racial justice, a majority of Americans stand with us. And yet we're in this awkward position of having to constantly say, we do matter. We do have a lot of votes, both in the constituent sense and in the congressional sense. Like, how do you deal with that?
I mean, I think that that's actually part of why we perform so well with the American Rescue Plan is the specific things that the progressives were fighting on are wildly popular. And so we saw, I mean, this was true for the outside groups, but it was also true for members of Congress that progressives out-organized the moderates. And part of the reason that they were able to do it is because they had these flagship issues, some of which had been key campaign promises in the Georgia runoff, right? So there had just been this moment where Democrats had promised voters survival checks, right? Like that had been a huge theme of that last stretch of the Georgia election. And so for progressives to really dig in and insist that the amount not be lower, that they not be means tested further, that eligibility, like all of that was wildly popular, and they were really like wind at their backs with the American people and trying to get that across. I think I'm excited to see what those flexes look like in the recovery fight, the sort of like next phase that we're looking at. I think the issues are like a little bit more complicated, but that same underlying dynamic that the things that progressives are fighting for are actually wildly popular is there for a lot of the pieces of the kind of build back better recovery phase of this. And I think if we can learn some of the lessons from what worked to have progressive members of Congress hold together and then be really strongly backed by groups that are also acting in coordination, if we can repeat some of those plays, I'm really, I don't know, I feel nervous saying that I too have a bout of optimism, but I'm feeling like we can accomplish some of those wins in this next round as well.
You guys, stop being nervous about the optimism. We like the optimism. This is good.
So, but let's actually be optimistic but clear-eyed too, because like I think it's important as progressives that I get yelled at on Twitter. Mary is way smarter than us and doesn't spend as much time on Twitter, but I get yelled at on Twitter from the left all the time, right? Like, the American Rescue Plan was nothing. It's a pittance. And I'm like, that's just factually untrue. It's 10% of GDP. The New Deal was 13% of GDP. Like, that's a fact. This is big. We had big wins in there, but we didn't win everything. And I feel like it's important to not be doom posters because they get nothing done. They're just like, we win. On the pension fund, multi-employer pension fund, we've been fighting this fight for 7 years. And this is what happens in Washington, D.C. We're fighting for 1 million workers who would have had their pensions stolen from them by Wall Street, and 4 million more who would have been severely impacted. These are people who fought for their wages. Pensions are deferred wages. Wall Street screwed them over. 7 years we've been fighting this fight. We won it bigger than we even imagined we could in the American Rescue Plan. I'm not going to pretend that 1 million workers getting their pensions saved is not a victory, right? Like that's what. So I want the doom posters to do better, but I don't think they will because they're doom posters. But we did lose on a few things, right? I mean, the big one was the minimum wage. But I kind of feel like the story of the minimum wage was not well told, because like if we remember the narrative going into the fight, it wasn't actually about the minimum wage. That was actually kind of like foisted into the story sort of surprisingly at a point. It seemed like the fight was going to be all about the checks, and we weren't going to even get any checks in, right? Like that wasn't in the discussion until progressives both in the Senate and the House flexed hard and were like, we will get checks. And then there's a whole thing about the $2,000 check versus the $1,400 check, which I get. But I also think, again, people need to see the specifics. $1,400 per person in the household, including children, instead of the previously, they reduced the amount. You're talking about, $5,600 for a household of four. You're talking about single parents with kids getting, these checks can be just lifesavers during this pandemic time. So these are very popular things, but we didn't win on the minimum wage. And I think that was a sort of, it was a loss. And it also, though, makes sense to me. It wasn't because progressives didn't try hard enough. We got it out of the House, right? Maybe speak to that, how it actually, they tried to get it out of they tried to remove, they being the moderates, trying to get it out of what passed the House. We got it passed out of the House with all of those votes, but then we lost by 8 in the Senate. And while that it sort of hurts and stings, it also, to me, the big thing is you only lose when you stop fighting or you forget what you're fighting for. So I thought that stung, the minimum wage loss, but it also really did. We gained a couple co-sponsors on it, and it gave us a real clear target list, a whip list. We need to get these 8 Democratic senators to where we want them to be on the minimum wage. It also sort of lays out some of the difficulties that I think you're pointing to when it comes to this next fight with the infrastructure and the Build Back Better. It's going to be hard to get 50 votes in the Senate on some of these big ticket items. Do you have any sort of insight on maybe what the minimum wage fight and loss side? Because we won on big things, but we did lose on some. Like what we can do better or just more?
There are so many thoughts. But before I talk about recovery, I actually want to be annoying and nitpick your take on what happened with the minimum wage. Like, yes, we, or not nitpick, I think just like a different frame on it is like, yes, we lost 8 votes in the Senate. But if minimum wage had been ruled in order and folks were voting up or down on a huge package, we wouldn't have lost by that much and we might actually have squeaked by. Maybe on a like, maybe it would have been like a slightly amended proposal or whatever. But I think like you can't tell the story of what happened with minimum wage and the fact that we lost it in the Senate without telling the story of the Senate filibuster, right? Which is this like arcane Senate rule that rather than having the Senate operate on a majoritarian basis requires a 60 vote threshold for anything to move in the Senate. A historically racist mechanism that has been used to deny rights for Black and Brown Americans for a long time. And the Senate is choosing every single day to continue operating at a 60 vote threshold and giving untold political power to Republicans that they did not earn at the ballot box, just handing it to them. And Senate Democrats are making that choice every day. And the fact that they forced the American Rescue Plan to go through the budget reconciliation process, which has like a lot of strings attached to it, rather than just moving it on regular order, really forced the minimum wage fight into this constrained box that made it harder for us to fight on. And if Senate Democrats had had the courage to abolish the filibuster and move the American Rescue Plan on regular order, I think we actually would have seen a different outcome. So yes, you're totally right. We picked up some co-sponsors. We have a whip list. We've got some work to do. We're not going to stop fighting. And there was a choice point here by Senate Democrats that really sort of torpedoed some of what we could have won in this plan if they had been able to act with more kind of clarity and procedural courage in the way that the Senate is being run.
So can we, Jocelyn, just, I know you've wanted to talk about this for weeks now. That just seems like the perfect segue over to, I think, a huge ticket thing. What we learned from the minimum wage fight is something that, like, what we all know. The Senate is actually an artifact of a racist construction, right? Like, I know our people usually know this, but if you don't, just Google the Great Compromise, right? I mean, it was set up, the structure of this country, to protect slave owners. They were worried that they would not have enough power, so they built a structure that gave them more power, and that means that we still have the whole Senate is an artifact of that. And then they're like, oh, it's not skewed enough. Let's skew it by 10 more votes is even more ridiculous. And the Senate writes their own rules. It's a self-governing body. So whatever 51 Senate votes want to do gets done. What I mean by that is you can change the rules. The rules are only constraining to you if you allow them to be, or you don't have 51 votes to change it. So I think that's the main thing we learned on the minimum wage fight, is that if we allow the Senate to continue and the Democrats in the Senate to throw up their hands on procedural hurdles, then we will never get HR 1, S1, the For the People Act, and these big democracy reforms actually done. There's no way we can get those bills done with the filibuster still in place. And the backdrop of that, the background of that, is these laws passing at the state level that are actively disenfranchising people based on their race and ethnicity. And so like the sort of tension, the need to do this now could not be more apparent. And I feel like that is what we learned when we lost on the minimum wage, because most of the votes did point to the procedural part, right? They said, oh, I just can't vote for it because the parliamentarian, this unelected, position said that it was quote unquote out of order. So like, let's talk about that. How do we do this? How do we get to where we can fix our democracies some?
Totally. And I'm like having to work hard to stay in the frame because I actually just want to be like jumping around and saying, preach, Alex. That's totally right. I think all of that is certainly true. And I think for, just to drive that home, like this is an existential moment for the functioning of our democracy, like whether or not we will choose to have a government that for the very first time actually represents and functions for all the people. And the tsunami of state legislation, of voter suppression state legislation, is absolutely the backdrop for all of this. I think, the Democratic caucus in the Senate is like in conversation right now about the filibuster, about everything from fully ending it to some significant rules reform that would defang it, or make it harder to use, or make it eventually overcomable. There's like a lot of different reform ideas that are out there. But at the end of the day, this is it. Can you operate the Senate on a majoritarian basis or not? And that is the question that we have to call at the end of the day. I think we've seen a lot of movement from people just in the last few months. You have senators who are not the like left wing progressive senators who are saying, you had both of the senators from Minnesota just out in the last month saying like, okay, we're convinced Republican obstructionism is real. There is no good faith offer of bipartisanship here for structural democracy reform, and we can't let the Senate filibuster stand in the way of protecting people's right to vote, of beginning to address money in politics, of beginning to address corruption of the democratic process, right? And I think when you start seeing folks like Senator Klobuchar, Senator Smith, Senator Heinrich, right, folks like that coming out and being like, okay, yeah, you're right. That's when you start to know that if we keep pushing strategically and smartly on this particular procedural hurdle, I think we'll see success. And for viewers out there, like you don't really need to know the details of the Senate filibuster. Like it's interesting. You could look it up if you wanted to, but I think delivering a really strong no excuses message to your representatives is actually what this is about. Like you as a constituent in whatever state that you live, you should not care about the Senate filibuster. It's not in the Constitution. It's not in the law anywhere. It's a dumb rule that a bunch of mostly white men decided to constrain themselves by to fail to deliver for you. And so like, you don't need to worry about the details of the Senate filibuster. What you need to do is be calling your senators and saying, this is what I expect in recovery. This is what I expect in terms of you safeguarding our elections. I don't want to hear any excuses. I want you to deliver for me, and I want you to deliver before summer, right? Like that is the message. The details of this are actually, to be totally honest, like not nearly as important as the pressure and consistent message and unified message from progressives all over the country.
And so, Mary, this is probably a small point, but could you really speak to the fact that pressure does work? Because I think that call your senator becomes this, I don't even want to call it a platitude, but something that people hear so frequently, it almost becomes the water we swim in advocacy. And like, could you really speak to the fact that that is important?
Yeah. And I think what I was saying about some of these senators that we've seen come out recently, acknowledging that we need to at least reform, if not fully eliminate the filibuster, is proof of it. Like constituents have been pushing in district on this over the last several months. And you see it in the way that their Hickenlooper is starting to move. Certainly, again, Klobuchar and Heinrich and Smith and some of the other ones who've come out, and even the elevated way that Schumer, the top Democrat in the Senate, is engaging on this is because of relentless pressure inside of New York to deliver from like a no excuses frame. I think at the end of the day, like pressure does work for people who are actually aligned on whatever the demand is. The question isn't like, do you agree on the merits that we should raise the minimum wage? Do you agree on the merits that we should make it possible for people to unionize in their workplace? Do you agree on the merits that we should have social benefits that actually work for people. It's what are you doing to play hardball, to tactically move that forward, to get it across the finish line. Democratic trifectas are rare and fleeting. And our obligation, like all of our obligation in this moment, is actually to lock in everything that we possibly can while we have the governing trifecta. And so what we need to do is make champions feel forced to act, to prioritize, to fully embody the championship and the prioritization to move it. And then actually, we don't have to get everybody else to agree. We just have to get them paralyzed to the point that they won't be a problem. And to go back to the American Rescue Plan, like that's what we saw happen. The moderates in the House did not agree with everything that was part of the American Rescue Plan, but they were fielding so many calls from constituents demanding checks, demanding an expansion of unemployment insurance, right? Like some of these different pieces that they were just like sort of paralyzed and didn't counter organize. And that's all we need. Paralyze the right flank so that they don't counter organize. Make sure the left flank is really well organized and get it across the finish line. That's true for the American Rescue Plan. I think Alex may have a different take, but I think that'll be true for recovery. And I think it's true for accomplishing filibuster, overcoming the filibuster as well.
I don't disagree. I love this part of the conversation, Jocelyn. I think that's one of the most important questions. I get it all the time, especially like when I get to go on Tom Hartman's show or guest host Tom Hartman's radio show, which has this enormous audience across the country. People will call up and they'll, like, especially as progressives, we don't always have the wind at our backs. We're quite often going into headwinds. We just got through the Trump era, right? Like I went around the country to fight Trump care when they were just going to destroy Medicaid, plant a bomb in Medicare, rip people's health care away. And, people were really feeling that they're attacked by their own government. And so you would get this, like, is a phone call really going to work? Is pressure and the alternative to that. And what you hear behind it is throwing up your hands and giving up. And I want to say, like, with so much force that in point of fact, there's literally a score sheet in these offices where they mark down what everybody calls for. And that's what runs DC. The reason lobbyists exist for the corporations is because they're just sitting there calling all the time, visiting so that their stuff is in front of these offices all the time. And that's what it is all about. And so, like, it's not just about calling, but calling is super effective. Once this pandemic is over and we can gather again, like going to offices, going to events, showing up and just making your voice heard is what pressure is. It's demanding that our elected officials understand, and maybe they need to be reminded that all power comes from the people. All power resides with the people. They are just temporarily allowed to hold the power that we create. And it's our voice and our power that's irresistible when we stand united and in solidarity with each other. And that's what that is. And it's so amazing that it can just come down to, in my world, as Social Security works, we have these amazing seniors. A lot of them, majority of them during the Trump care fight were actually older women who are just making phone calls to their senators every day. Every single day, making those phone calls. And we were focused in Maine, Arizona, and Nevada, and it all came down to Arizona. And, like, we win some, we lose some. Like I said, the only real loss is when you stop fighting. You forget what you're fighting for, or you give up. So if a tactic is not exactly working, like, emailing offices is not as beneficial as calling, then you switch tactics a little bit and, maybe they'll return to faxing offices. You can still fax your elected representatives, and that's a good way of getting something in there that's unique. I know it's weird, but it's true. They'll be like, man, I even got a fax on this one. But what we're talking about at the end of the day is just power, and it's how we demonstrate power. And actually the opposite of power is apathy. It's doing nothing. It's throwing your hands up. And if the corporations and Wall Street weren't terrified of our people power, they wouldn't spend all of that money telling us that we don't have it. They wouldn't spend all this money creating a situation that makes it seem like it's hopeless. So I want to say, going into these next fights, that even though there's long odds on some of them, we also got to fight for more than what we want. That's a strategy that I think I'd love to hear your view on, Mary. The way that Chomsky said the way that you can control people is define the limits of the debate and then encourage vigorous debates within those limits. And the way you change the world is by changing the limits of the debate. You change the story. You change the narrative and what is possible. And I feel like that's where we have to be on the filibuster, because the filibuster is absolutely the limits, right? They're like, oh, I'm sorry, I'm with you, but we just can't do it. And we're saying no excuses, change the rules. The rules don't let you do the thing that you want to do. Well, you write the rules, change the rules.
Right. So totally ditto to that point about refusing to accept a debate that's framed inside of the current rules. But the other thing, to go back to the minimum wage, to say, and this is about like asking for more, is from my perspective, the role the minimum wage played in shielding a lot of the rest of the American Rescue Plan. Mm-hmm. And that part of the reason to push for, like, this bill is going to start in the House, probably, for the House bill to be as progressive and pushing the boundaries of what's possible, is because of what we saw play out with the minimum wage, which is that was like the marquee fight. There was a lot of attention on it. A lot of Senate offices were like devoting capacity to responding to constituents about it. And it really shielded some of the other parts of the bill from as much scrutiny as I think that they would have gotten otherwise. And I think if the minimum wage hadn't been part of that, if we hadn't had that like high profile loss, then there would have been more attention diverted to like maybe the child tax credit. Maybe it would have been a different thing. But that shielding effect, I think, is so important for these big packages. And so as we're building out our demands for the recovery package, I think making sure that we're intentionally seeding things that we know push the boundaries a little bit. We know we might not have 50 votes in the Senate, but we're going to push and amp up those fights and talk about them really aggressively, and take advantage of that shielding effect. I also think it's just strategically a smart thing that we did, and that, as you said, changes the frame of the debate for next time in our set of expectations. So it sort of does double work for us there, even though, again, from a legislative perspective.
Jocelyn, you want to take over for a bit while Mary's internet figures itself out?
Mary, you're back. Sorry, we lost you for like 1 second.
Yeah, it was what you were saying is just super important for all fights. And if you've ever negotiated a contract, or know contract negotiators in labor, like they'll be the first to tell you, if you want a wage increase or whatever, if you've bought something and there's been a negotiation, you don't go in and ask for exactly what you want. You ask for more. And it's one of the lessons you'll learn quite quickly in politics, is that if you're the leftmost person at the table, you're going to fall off before it gets across the finish line. So it really behooves you to bring someone to your left, and have and be smart about it. Like, we know we're doing this. Demand that and everyone gets a pony, and then this is what the right does really effectively, right? I mean, because it allows you to stay on offense the whole time, and it generally works. So Democrats have slowly begrudgingly learned that strategy, but the right has been using this for a long time to just drag the whole debate so far to the right that it's almost unrecognizable. Like the quote unquote radical leftist things that we're talking about is like, maybe corporations shouldn't be able to kill us for profit. And they're like, I don't know about that. Seems quite out of bounds. Jocelyn, I took your spot, so sorry.
Now I'm talking over Mary. She was speaking, and then the internet. So a lot of the things we're talking about, I do think it's really important. It seems almost obvious, so obvious it's not worth mentioning, but like, this does not only does this work, but I would argue, and argue quite strongly, that this history and this legacy of activism is the origins of America. And I don't even necessarily mean the founding fathers, because I think we can all agree they were wealthy slave owners, but I mean more the way that we interact with America today, whether you're talking about the freedom women enjoy, the freedom that, or I don't want to say freedom because that makes it sound like we're privileged. Like, no, they were oppressing us, now they're oppressing us less. But all of these rights that exist in this country are the legacy of very successful organizing movements. And it's really weird because I do still to this day, you encounter cynicism about these things, which is so funny to me because we win every single time. I always think back to that time we had Paul Farmer on our show and like asked him, how do you keep doing this really difficult work? And he was like, well, because we always win. And I think that level of optimism, because you guys are right, we should be a little bit skeptically optimistic. We shouldn't take it for granted. But I think the way to be perhaps optimistic without recklessness is to recognize if we do the work, we will eventually win. I mean, do you guys disagree with that?
It's to you, Mary. I'm going to answer after.
And probably with a lot to say.
I mean, it's me, so obviously.
Y'all are hilarious. No, I think that that's right. That organized people power backing a smart strategy is what will win every time, which doesn't mean we'll win every individual fight, right?
Yes.
Continue like the march of progress to deliver more liberation for more people over time. And especially if the people who won their fight then stay in it to make sure that the next one is their fight as well, right? And this is, as I understand it, the whole point of the show is like essentially about solidarity across the multiple kind of oppression and systems that we face. So yeah, I do totally agree with that. The other thing that I will say though about, and this is actually in response to what Alex was saying earlier about what the right does really well in sort of pulling out the flank of negotiation by saying ever more extreme racist, nationalist, pro-corporate power consolidation-y kinds of things. And then making all of these other, like still actually abhorrent things seemed mainstream in comparison. I think all of that is right. And I would say we have to like hold two truths, that there is this like, there should always be an insatiable appetite for more, demanding more liberation, more equality, more justice for people. Yes, that is true. And the other truth that we have to hold in tension is the thing that I was saying before about democratic trifectas being rare and fleeting, and it being, I believe, our obligation in this moment to take relentless, disciplined, focused advantage of that to win everything that we can. And this gets back to what Alex was saying about being yelled at by people on Twitter, which is not something I'm sad is not a huge part of my life. Is that appetite for more is good. It helps pull out the flank. It helps make the like sort of soft threats from progressives in Congress that if you don't protect these things, you won't have our votes on final passage more credible. There's a role for that, but I do worry that sometimes we can get pulled too far in that direction and not lock in wins that we can while we do. And part of the reason I think that's so important is because winning this like constant march of more liberation for more people depends on like the Overton window, the window of possibility, not swinging in a whiplashy way too far in the other direction. And one of the things that protects us from a rightward swing is things we've locked in through legislation, that we've normalized, that become part of the system. That is a protective thing for us from a rightward swing. And so part of the reason we should lock in wins is because they're good for people. They get money in people's pockets and redistribute power throughout our system. And that is a good. And part of the reason we should lock in wins is because it's protective against a further rightward swing that we all just lived through a 4-year hellish version of right under Trump. But yes, those are caveats to say I totally agree with the kind of underlying premise of what you were saying, Jocelyn, around sort of organized solidarity being the thing that
it sounds so basic, but I'm shocked by how much like people don't necessarily get how much victory we've really experienced. And I think it's because it's so obvious that sometimes it goes over people's heads that these social movements not only are powerful, but have shaped pretty much everything we take for granted about the modern world. And now we have exciting new modern challenges. But I'm sorry, Alex, I interrupted you. What were you going to say?
I wasn't saying anything. You didn't interrupt me.
You were
Also,
going to say something. I
yeah, but
know
that's
it.
true 100% of the time. 100% of the time, I'm like, ooh, I got something I should share with the world, whether or not I should. But it reminds me of this discussion reminds me of this really beautiful speech I saw Don Nichols give at a conference, and it was on what is losing. It was actually around when Bernie Sanders lost the primary nomination in 16. And if you think that politicians are leading indicators, then political losses really sting. But if you think that politicians are actually lagging indicators and the people lead where we're going, then political losses don't sting as much because you're able to see a bigger fight going on. And what he talked about is Eugene Debs. And Eugene Debs lost quite a few political fights. And he did it much more eloquent than me because he's a very eloquent man, John Nichols. But he said, he fought for labor laws that protect workers' rights to collectively bargain and form a union. But he lost that political campaign. He fought for a social security system that protects people when they lose wages because of becoming old or disabled and not being able to work. But he lost that political campaign. And he fought for, you guys get the point, a minimum wage so that the bosses can't extract the productivity from the workers and grind them into dust, and the workers are able to get the fruits of their own labor. But he lost that political campaign. But then FDR came in with the New Deal, and a lot of that had already been built, and all of those ideas won. So did Eugene Debs really lose? Was he actually looking to get elected himself? Was that the end all and be all? And I think this is important for why we do what we do. And a big difference between like a progressive fighting for a better future and like Matt Gaetz or one of these, criminal Republicans who is just a narcissistic sociopath is that sometimes we lose a fight, but we actually have advanced the battle for liberation, for justice, an incredible distance. And again, you have to hold these things in your head. Stay thirsty. I always say, like, it's great when people are like, yes, we got this big win, but I want more. I'm like, yes, that's what we want. But when it turns to doom, there's a fine line there. And you have to be able to look at a bigger picture and remember that politicians are lagging indicators, because a politician is never going to lead us into a future of justice and liberation. We, the people, will push some politician, and it doesn't really matter who, to carry that mantle for us. But all power is with the people. So I just, I sort of sum it up with a slightly inappropriate thing that I tell people all the time, which is in the infamous words of Freeway Rick Ross, don't get high on your own supply. When you're fighting these battles, don't get confused about like what we're fighting for, because then you might think you lost when you actually won. So anyways, Mary, you don't have to agree with my Freeway Rick Ross write-up of it, but that's where I see some of the tension is actually just in how zoomed in on the fight are you? Like, was this fight the fight, and then the things that we didn't win means we lost on them? Or is it just one battle in a fight that is ongoing forever? The struggle, as it were, that we will continue to fight to make a better future, and we're never going to win 100%. And that's hard to like grok and feel in your heart. Like, we're only going to win parts of it, but we're going to just keep fighting to advance, getting better and better and better.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think the other piece of it that is like a little a little more about, I mean, what you're talking about is like the morally, I believe the like morally correct framing from it, but the strategic piece is also like holding this balance between making sure that you're building momentum so that wins beget wins, right? And so that we're telling the story of how progressives flexed in the American Rescue Plan in order to help them flex better and harder in the recovery fight, right? But building momentum. On the flip side of that, making sure that you're never celebrating like hollowed out trash and pretending that it's good when it's not, because then you're basically helping hollowed out trash beget hollowed out trash. But I think that like morally, yes, totally agree with your big umbrella. More zoomed in, looking at these individual legislative fights that we're going to see over the next several months, making sure you're celebrating real wins so you get more, making sure that you're not ever lying to the people about these like fake whitewashed wins. Is like the other side of those judgment calls as folks are like storytelling about what has happened and what we're in the middle of right now.
I love that you say that, Mary, because I really have been thinking about this. Not, have you guys seen The Social Dilemma? It's this terrifying documentary on Netflix. I was late to the game, but it's basically about how social media has really altered our ability to communicate and in a very scary way. Anyway, but I obviously was reflecting on this as somebody who works in progressive media and organizes, like, okay, so how do we do this ethically? How do we engage with these digital spaces in ways which are good and pure and not becoming the charlatans we wish to vanquish in the world? And I love what you're saying, Mary, because it's like, you're right. You know what? Psychologically, politically, what's true always wins out eventually. So for us to talk about the ways we win, we have to be talking about the ways we win authentically and not things which are shiny and viral or whatever. We have to be discussing actual victories. Like, what is your advice for people on how to do that?
Never tweet. Is it never tweet, Mary? That'd be really good advice.
I'm not going to wade into that, but I think I think it's for people to speak authentically to their experience. And I think this thing that Alex was talking about the line between hope and doom is right. Like, a lot of people just got checks to their bank accounts. A lot of people are getting expanded unemployment insurance that they wouldn't have been eligible for were it not for this. Parents of young kids are going to start receiving support through the child tax credit. Like, that's going to be real things that are experienced in people's lives. And I think that there, as we have seen, like, our society disintegrate, right? With like the consolidation of corporate power and unregulated capitalism and rampant white supremacy and climate collapse. Like, what everyone is seeing is a society that doesn't serve the interests of the many, globally, domestically, even at the local level. And so it's understandable that people are falling back into like this kind of deep cynicism. And it's understandable that when you talk to young activists today, their like primary language is one of snark, right? Like, I understand where that's coming from. It makes sense. Like, maybe part of it is the way that social media is feeding us and programming it, but part of it is people understandably looking at the societal structures around them and rightly assessing, these were not built to support me. These were not built to support community thriving and community well-being, and responding with an absolutely justified cynicism. So I think that how we do it is to be able to find that hope in organizing and solidarity together. And then just talk about what you've seen, the moments where a vaccine clinic actually began to like move us beyond the pandemic, where you got a check or your neighbor got a check or your mom got a check that was life-changing for them. Like, I think that those stories of government actually beginning to work for people as like beginning to light the pathway from like the really broken place we are right now to a possible future that is like liberatory and extraordinarily different, is like how we light the path for each other to keep being on this journey. Like, yeah, in politics, yeah, in Congress, but also just like in our community lives together. That's how we light the path towards a different future for all of us.
Mm-hmm. We should have Mary on more very hopeful conversations that are also very rooted in the actual strategy of how we win fights. And I just want to sort of end our conversation with this, like, I don't know, shout out or something to Indivisible, because something that I say and have said for years, that you are getting to the story of what a check meant for people, is the best way, the only way to combat cynicism is solidarity, but not like the word. I mean, literally getting together with other people and feeling how powerful you are. And after the pandemic, when there's a protest against something, feeling how powerful and how no one can ignore you when you're standing shoulder to shoulder with your people, raising your voices together. And I feel like the creation of Indivisible is what was pretty amazing. Is like this, this fascist got elected in America, and it just shocked the system. It shocked a lot of people who thought the system wasn't that broken. There were a lot more people who thought, yeah, this is exactly where it would lead to. But Indivisible was able to sort of form from this really disaggregated, like, people standing up and trying to be like, how do I use my power and feel powerful? And gave a framework of like, stand united together in solidarity and demand that the system work for you and for your neighbors and for your family. And it's a beautiful thing when you see that, it actually is the only magic that I think exists in this world, is actually the magic of solidarity, that like, through forces that seem unconquerable, together we can win. So how can people be part of that magic, Mary? How do people sort of get involved with Indivisible and with these fights?
Yeah, so the best thing to do, if you're not already connected to an Indivisible, there are Indivisible groups in every single congressional district across the country. So if you're not already connected to one, and really the question is, find your people, find your geographically co-located people to be in struggle with at the local and state and federal level to deliver on these outcomes for people. And so you just need a crew. It doesn't have to be an Indivisible crew, but if you don't have another one, they're a great option. Go to indivisible.org and just click on the map and figure out where the group is that's closest to you, and hook up. But figure out how to be part of an organizing infrastructure, just for like the community of it, but also for the aggregated power of it, to be able to take on these structures that don't serve all of us, challenge them and demand, and then ultimately win different outcomes.
Thank you, Mary, so much for joining us here on Solidarity Live.
Seriously, thank you. I know this is like a show, but it feels like therapy for me. I feel very inspired.
Thanks for having me, y'all. This has been fun.
I'll see
Bye.
you later.
Yeah, it's a great conversation to have and be, reminded really straightforwardly of what we say every show, that, people power united in pragmatic solidarity actually wins.
Well, there's psychological reasons for the valence of this conversation as well. One of the exciting things happening in the psychological world over the past couple of decades is this growth of positive psychology, where, for the first 100 years, psychology was studying negative emotions, like, why do schizophrenic people act the way we do? And now what we're learning is that hope and inspiration and all these things are so much more motivating than fear and helplessness and despair that it's crazy, which sounds obvious to us now, maybe, I don't know. But there was definitely a time where we thought that people were primarily negatively motivated species, but they're not.
It's still the dominant, negative. So we have, I love taking this conversation here. I know we've talked about it before, Jocelyn, but Sigmund Freud's nephew actually created modern advertising. And the entirety of the advertising framework, which you can also think of as trillions of dollars of propaganda that's beamed directly into our brains and is affecting us every single minute of our waking lives. And we're like, oh, I don't think it affects me. And when you ask people, they're like, oh, it definitely affects those people, everyone else. But I'm not affected by advertising. We're deeply, deeply affected by advertising. And that's why my razor has 4 razor blades on it, right? Like there's no way 4 is better than 3, but I still bought the one with 4. You have bought things that are not useful to you. And the reason is because of a psychological trick that was found out after World War II, and it's called inferiority marketing. And it's actually based on just negative emotions. They don't have to even be related to each other, but in the manosphere, the grossest part of the internet, and all of that stuff, they call it negging when it comes to interpersonal stuff. There is a psychological response that advertisers and people can take advantage of, that you make somebody feel bad and then you insert something that's a solution to that feeling bad. And again, they don't have to be related. It can be like, do you think, is being not tall enough holding you back at work? Buy a GM truck. It'll make you bigger. And it works. That actually inferiority marketing works. But what we're seeing, and it's not fast, that's still the dominant marketing. You can watch a television commercial to watch it. And I'm not saying Nike's a good company, so don't get me wrong. But Nike actually is one of the leaders on the new type, which is a positive. It's a hope-based advertising, and it's the opposite of inferiority. It's saying you're the hero in this movement, and you can be empowered to do great things. And then they're like, oh yeah, and our shoes are associated with that positive stuff.
Well, and this is the thing, when it comes to building social movements, Melissa Byrne, who had on here a couple times, points us out a lot about climate organizing. There's this temptation in the political world to message around despair, like, we have about 5 minutes before extinct from the earth. The problem with that is only motivating in very small doses, and very small doses of action do not a political movement make. The way to motivate us to build collective power over time and to use every opportunity at our disposal to build a better future is through hope, joy, happiness, and enjoyment of each other and enjoyment of the work. One of my favorite ideas out there psychologically is this idea of flow, this idea of existing from a state of positive, escalated, focused emotion. And that is the attitude we need to come to this organizing with a sense of possibility, because otherwise, not only will you burn out, but it's very difficult to win if we're approaching this from the point of view that we can't. Like, it makes sense. Why would you play chess if you know the other person's going to win? Why would you, play sports if you automatically assume you'll lose you wouldn't, right? You'd be like, well, that's no fun. We have to come to this with the sense that we can win, and we have won. The only reason that we don't hire 5-year-olds to make t-shirts in this country is because of the American labor movement. Granted, they do that in other countries, so there are clearly victories to win still, but yeah.
And the point you're making is exactly right for why we have to actually tell people what it is that we want to build, and sell the positive vision of what we're fighting for. And that's super important. We have to welcome people into the struggle and say, look, we might not win everything all at once, but we will win. And this is what we're building. When we sell Medicare for all, it's not negative. Negative is like sometimes useful for some specific battles, like inferiority marketing does work. But when you want the movement to win, you sell what we're doing. We're building a healthcare system where if you get sick, you get the care that you need. No more copays, no more deductibles. Vision is covered, hearing is covered, dental is covered, long-term care is covered. This is the system that we're building. We're building a world where workers can get the fruits of their labors, and it's not just poverty wage so that some billionaire can buy another golden yacht. It's workers working in a place that they are part of with dignity, and selling the vision of what we're actually talking about, what we're fighting for. That to me is also the antidote for burnout is a really real thing. Usually comes from lack of agency and autonomy, and burnout is like the enemy of all organizing. And reminding people what we're fighting for all the time is the antidote to it. So, because when I say we only lose when we forget what we're fighting for, it's because I've seen many people burn out by forgetting what we're fighting for. It just seemed like another iteration of the same fight over and over again. And the inevitability of da 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 da, that's burnout, because you lost the hope and the thread of why we wake up. And I'll let you do the full positive, because I want to just sprinkle on some spite as well. It's also okay to be like, oh yeah, and we'll crush our sociopathic big pharma enemies to dust and build a system based on justice in the ashes. That's okay too. That's hopeful in its own weird way.
I mean, it's funny you say that, because I'm like, I actually think that as much as I would love that, who doesn't want to see their enemies driven before them and hear the wailing of their women and whatnot? But I think that one thing that we have to really, and I know we have to close out the show, but we need to realize we're not asking for too much. And this is something we touch on in every show. Our ideas are not radical. Like, one of the things I was writing about unrelatedly last night is how for millennials and Gen Z, I would posit that a lot of what is termed commitment phobia is actually that we don't have an economy that's conducive to getting married and having a family, which, like, how crazy is that? What we're asking for isn't like riches beyond our wildest imagination. We're asking for a world that is livable, to enjoy the basic milestones of human development, like becoming parents, having a dignified old age, having an environment we can enjoy. We are not asking for too much, and I think we should take hope in that. Like, what we want isn't some utopia of like where there are no more problems. What we want is to be able to have basic human flourishing that is more than possible with the resources at our disposal. So, Alex, do you want to close us out, actually?
That was the closing us out. You did it. You just had to say, and through solidarity,
and
that's where we're going to go.
Thank you so much, everybody. We will see you next Friday. Find Indivisible, get involved with them, and get involved in general, and harass your members of Congress. That's what
Find your people and get organized and feel the power of organized people power. Because you'll like it. It'll feel good. It'll make you feel good. So we'll see you next week, everybody.
Bye.